The vintage ceiling fan overhead rotated in slow, agonizing circles, emitting a dry, metallic screech that scraped against the heavy silence of the room. The acoustic environment consisted solely of that monotonous mechanical whine, accompanied by the dry, fibrous sound of rough paper pages sliding against one another as I sorted through the endless stacks of unverified documents. I sat hunched over a massive oak table in the absolute center of the subterranean stone vault, illuminated only by the focused, yellow glow of a small desk lamp. The air down here in the Chicago Police Evidence Archive in the dead of winter in 1981 was thick, stagnant, and choked with the distinct chemical tang of treated paper, cold pipe tobacco, and aging printing ink that clung stubbornly to the back of my throat. Have you ever experienced that profound, suffocating isolation that settles over you when you're locked in a windowless stone cellar at 3 in the morning, miles away from any living soul, while the rest of the world sleeps in warm, undisturbed beds? People always talk about night archiving as quiet, methodical labor where you catalog history and lose yourself in routine. They imagine that silence is empty, neutral, and harmless. They do not know the agonizing psychological weight of a basement where every square inch of shelf space holds the forgotten wreckage of unsolved murders, unidentified victims, and closed investigations that nobody cared to finish. They do not know what it feels like when the only auditory companion you have for hours on end is the scratch of your own needle stitching tags into dead files. I reached out with my right hand, my fingers brushing against the coarse linen thread I used to manually bind paper index cards to wooden evidence tags. My job wasn't glamorous, nor was it safe in the psychological sense. I was Matthew, a junior archive technician tasked with processing the unidentified homicide files. My entire responsibility was manual and meticulous, opening forgotten wooden boxes containing the personal belongings of victims whose killers were never found, cleaning the rusted metal tools, and securing paper identification tags with hand-stitched white linen thread before sealing the archive away for good. Hundreds of boxes. Hundreds of faceless names. Filed away by case number, categorized by precinct, and left to gather dust in the dark until the paper rotted away entirely and the memories vanished with it. Except tonight, the work schedule had brought a box to my table that felt heavier, colder, and fundamentally different from the rest. Think about how blindly we trust our institutional storage systems, believing that as long as we place a case number on a wooden box and seal it with wax, the violence of the crime stays safely contained inside. We file the reports, we lock the wooden lids, and we tell ourselves that the past stays dead once it is out of sight. We believe that a bureaucratic archive is a safe mausoleum for history. Then a red wax seal cracks under your thumb, and you realize the box isn't just holding belongings, it's holding an invitation. I forced my eyes away from the dark shelves lining the stone walls, lifted my heavy ceramic mug of bitter, lukewarm coffee from the edge of the desk, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The sharp taste of chicory coated my tongue, matching the chemical odor of old ink drifting up from the storage crates in the shadows. My boots rested on the cold, damp stone floor, my muscles aching from the persistent chill that seeped right through my wool trousers from the foundation below. Nothing moved in the archive. Just the flickering yellow light of the desk lamp, casting long, jittery shadows across the endless rows of iron shelving units. Then, right from the center of the wooden table directly in front of me, a sharp, distinct cracking sound broke the silence of the room as I pressed my thumbs into the brittle red wax seal of case 42. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if you had to break the seal on a box of evidence belonging to someone the world forgot? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. I set the broken pieces of red wax aside on the wood with a heavy, deliberate thud, my heart giving a sudden, violent lurch against my ribs as I slowly lifted the heavy lid of the wooden box. The heavy wooden lid of case 42 lifted with a dry, splintering groan that echoed sharply against the damp limestone walls, releasing a dense, choking cloud of stale, trapped dust that caught the yellow beam of the desk lamp like floating gold flakes. I leaned back instinctively, coughing into my sleeve as the foul odor of ancient dust, damp earth, and preserved leather billowed up from the interior of the box. Inside, resting neatly upon a thick bed of yellowed newspaper clippings from November 1974, lay the meager, pathetic remnants of a human life completely erased from the registries, a heavy hunting knife coated in a thick layer of dry, black rust, a torn woolen winter coat smelling faintly of riven rot, an empty personal notebook with blank pages save for a single sheet written in a trembling, frantic hand, and a dusty, compact cassette tape. Have you ever experienced that sudden, sickening jolt of adrenaline when unearthing an object meant to stay hidden at the bottom of a locked archive forever? People always talk about historical artifacts as quiet pieces of the past, old coins, faded photographs, or harmless relics of a different era. They imagine that time washes away the danger inherent in physical objects, turning weapons into museum pieces and clothing into harmless fabric. They do not know the quiet, blood-freezing horror of holding a personal cassette tape recovered from a crime scene where the victim was never identified and the killer was never caught. They do not know what it feels like when an ordinary piece of analog plastic feels like a loaded weapon waiting to discharge its contents into an empty room. I reached down with trembling fingers, my hand hesitating for a fraction of a second over the cold steel of the rusted hunting knife before I brushed past it to pick up the single handwritten page from the notebook. The ink was faded to a dull, sickly brown, but the handwriting itself was erratic, sharp, and violent, bearing down so hard on the paper that the pen had nearly torn right through the fibrous grain. I brought the page closer to the desk lamp and read the lines silently in the dim, flickering light. Asterisk, he did not kill me for money, he killed me because he wanted to wear my face. Asterisk. A cold, greasy shiver raced down the back of my neck, raising the hairs on my arms as I dropped the paper back onto the wooden table as if it had burned my skin. My eyes drifted immediately to the small plastic cassette tape resting beside the rusted blade. The paper label on the top of the cassette was completely blank, marred only by a series of deep, frantic scratches carved into the plastic casing with the sharp tip of a blade, jagged, deliberate marks that looked less like accidental wear and more like a desperate attempt to deface an inscription. Think about how desperately we rely on the safety of our distance from history, believing that decades of time create an unbreakable barrier between ourselves and the violence of old crimes. We read the files, we handle the relics, and we tell ourselves that whatever happened back then belongs safely to the past, tucked neatly away in municipal drawers where it can no longer hurt anyone. We believe that time is an absolute shield. Then you pick up an analog tape from a cold case, and you realize some sounds never stop playing in the dark, waiting only for someone to close the circuit. I reached over to the far corner of the desk where a small, portable cassette player sat plugged into a dusty wall outlet with a frayed black cord. It was an old, heavy metal and plastic unit with mechanical piano key buttons, the kind used by field investigators in the 70s for recording suspect interviews and dictating notes in the field. Without giving myself time to think, without allowing my rational mind to step in and remind me that this was just an unverified archive box from an abandoned case, I pressed the eject button. The plastic door popped open with a sharp, mechanical snap, accompanied by the internal whir of springs and levers. I picked up the scratched cassette, slid it carefully into the gaping deck, and pushed the plastic door shut with a solid, echoing click that sounded far too loud in the silent cellar. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would hesitate before pressing play on a tape found in a box marked with a blood-crusted seal? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. I placed my index finger squarely over the black plastic play button, took a deep, unsteady breath of the chemical-laden air, and pressed down hard until the internal mechanism locked firmly and irrevocably into place. The machine hummed softly for a fraction of a second, the internal motor spinning the magnetic rubber belts against the playback head as the gears engaged with a quiet, mechanical sigh. Then, the small internal speaker came alive. At first, there was no voice, only a dense, heavy wall of high-frequency static and analog tape hiss that crackled like burning brushwood in an empty fireplace, filling the stagnant air of the vault with a sharp, piercing hiss. HSSS. The acoustic environment shifted instantly and completely, replaced by that monotonous analog interference that drowned out the distant hum of the overhead ceiling fan and turned the quiet stone cellar into a buzzing cavern of electronic noise. Have you ever experienced that absolute, marrow-freezing terror when an audio recording starts playing in an empty room, and the background noise on the tape matches the exact acoustic properties of the space you are sitting in? People always talk about audio recordings as distant echoes, voices captured in another place, another year, completely detached from the present moment. They imagine that a tape player is a window looking back safely into history, keeping the listener insulated behind layers of plastic and magnetic coating. They do not know the suffocating disorientation of listening to an old cassette hiss and realizing that the ambient room noise recorded on the tape isn't from a cabin in 1974, it is the exact sound of your own archive breathing back at you, layer for layer, frequency for frequency. They do not know what it feels like when an analog frequency bridges 7 years of dead time in a single second, turning the present moment into a mirror of the past. I froze over the desk, my hand still resting on the edge of the plastic casing, my eyes glued to the small plastic reels visible through the transparent window of the cassette as they spun slowly, feeding the brown ribbon from left to right. The hiss continued for several long, agonizing seconds, filling the silence until my ears began to ring with the frequency. Then, out from beneath the dense wall of static, a sound emerged. Heavy, ragged breathing. It was a wet, labored intake of air, followed immediately by the soft, rhythmic scraping of wood moving against rough stone floorboards. Then, a voice spoke directly through the tiny speaker. It was a low, raspy whisper, muffled slightly by distance and tape degradation, but carrying a terrifying, crystal-clear intimacy that made my blood run cold in my veins. You think you are hidden away down here, Matthew, sorting through the scraps of things that have no names. Think about how arrogant we become in our locked rooms, believing that thick stone walls, midnight hours, and subterranean isolation are enough to keep unwanted visitors away from our work. We lock the doors, we turn on our desk lamps, and we tell ourselves we are completely alone with our tasks, safe behind the walls of bureaucracy. We believe that physical distance and locked doors are an absolute guarantee of safety against things that happened years before we were born. Then an old cassette tape calls you by your exact name from 7 years in the past, and you realize the person on the recording didn't record history, they recorded your arrival. The voice on the tape didn't pause or stutter. It continued, its tone shifting smoothly from a whisper to a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to vibrate directly inside the small plastic housing of the player, shaking the wooden table beneath my hands. You check the tags, you stitch the linen thread, you think you are the only one cataloging the boxes tonight. A sharp metallic scrape echoed from the speaker, the distinct, unmistakable sound of a heavy steel file drawer sliding open in an empty, echoing room. Look behind you, archivist. I am standing right now behind filing cabinet number 7. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay on the desk if a voice on a tape told you exactly where a killer was standing in your room? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. My heart seized in my chest, my breath stopping completely in my throat as my head whipped around in a blind, terrified panic toward the dark, shadowed corner of the vault where filing cabinet number 7 stood swallowed in absolute blackness. The heavy metal filing cabinet stood silent and motionless in deep stone shadows, its dark face reflecting nothing of the yellow light from my desk lamp. I stared at the narrow gap, my eyes straining against darkness, expecting a hand, shadow, or figure to detach itself from the iron at any second. Every muscle in my neck was locked tight, every nerve ending screaming at me to look away, yet I found myself incapable of blinking, terrified a single movement would invite whatever hid in that darkness to cross the room. Have you ever experienced that complete, paralyzing motor failure when your brain screams at your legs to run, but your nervous system refuses to send a signal because the terror is too immense to process. People always talk about fight or flight responses as lightning-fast reflexes that kick in the moment danger appears. They imagine that fear makes you move with speed, agility, and decisiveness. They do not know the deadening weight of absolute shock that nails your boots to the stone floor, turns your blood to cold water, and robs your limbs of all coordination. They do not know what it feels like when your entire world shrinks down to the space between where you sit and the dark corner where you know something waits for you, leaving you trapped inside your paralyzed body. From the small portable cassette player on the oak table, the audio shifted abruptly from the whispered warning into a sudden, ear-splitting shriek of pure, unfiltered human agony. Aaaah! The screech tore through the tiny speaker with violent volume, the plastic casing rattling against the wood, nearly tipping the machine over. At the exact same instant, the magnetic ribbon inside the deck snapped taut with a sharp, metallic twang. Before my trembling hand could reach the stop button, the brown magnetic tape began spilling out of the shell on its own, pulled by an invisible tension from deep inside as if an unseen hand was violently dragging it out through the slot in a frantic frenzy. ZZZZT, RIP. Think about how much faith we place in our mechanical equipment, believing that tape decks, lamps, and locks operate strictly according to the laws of engineering, electricity, and human control. We push buttons, plug in cords, and trust that tools will do what we command, remaining harmless extensions of our hands. We believe machines are neutral instruments of labor that cannot be subverted by whatever is lurking in the margins of our files. Then a dead tape starts pulling its own ribbon out in a frenzy, shredding itself across the desk, and you realize the machine has become a conduit for something that wants to drag you directly into the audio track. Before my brain could process the frantic movement of the tape, every single light in the subterranean stone vault went pitch black. The overhead fluorescent banks clicked off simultaneously with a loud, unified buzz, plunging the outer perimeter into total darkness. The only illumination left in the entire cellar was the small desk lamp beside me, which began to flicker violently, its yellow bulb pulsing up and down in frantic, blinding arcs as if struggling against a massive power drain sucking electricity straight out of the wiring. And out from the deep shadows of filing cabinet number 7, a tall, gaunt human figure wrapped in the ruined folds of a heavy, mud-caked winter coat stepped slowly into the dim perimeter of the lamplight. He didn't make a sound as he walked, no footsteps on the stone floor, no rustle of fabric, only the heavy, suffocating scent of stagnant river mud and freezing earth preceding him. His face was completely obscured by the deep shadow of his turned-up collar, but in his right hand, catching the weak yellow flicker of the desk lamp, gleamed the long, sharp steel eye of the manual archiving needle I had been using to stitch my evidence tags. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep working if a man from an unsolved murder file walked out of the dark carrying your own stitching needle? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. As the tall figure advanced toward my desk with slow, mechanical precision, the heavy iron security doors at the far end of the archive slammed shut with a deafening, thunderous crash that vibrated through the foundation. Bang! Heavy deadbolts slid home into their stone frames from the outside, locking the vault with a final, unalterable mechanical echo that sealed the cellar shut for good. I pressed my back hard against the edge of the oak table, my fingers clawing desperately at the wood as the tall figure stepped into the direct light, raising the sharp steel needle toward my face while the cassette player continued to screech its dying mechanical noises. The yellow beam of the desk lamp flickered violently, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the heavy oak table as the tall figure in the mud-caked winter coat stepped closer to the edge of the light. I couldn't scream. My throat was clamped shut, paralyzed by the realization that the man standing before me possessed no face, only smooth, pale skin stretched taut across bone, completely devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth, yet radiating an intense, suffocating awareness that pinned me to my chair. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to bolt, but my legs felt like lead weights fused to the floorboards beneath the desk. Have you ever experienced that complete psychological breakdown when an abstract nightmare materializes right in front of you, turning every rational defense you possess into dust in a fraction of a second? People always talk about fear as an emotion you can fight off with logic, preparation, or a weapon within arm's reach. They imagine that horror is something that stays confined to stories, old files, and closed boxes, things that can be reasoned with or locked away behind bureaucratic procedures. They do not know the suffocating paralysis of watching a faceless entity step out of an archival darkroom, holding the very tool you use to log the dead. They do not know what it feels like when the physical environment around you begins to dissolve into a waking nightmare where every rule of human existence ceases to apply, leaving you entirely defenseless against a presence that has no name and no face. The figure stopped just 2 paces from my desk, the heavy scent of river silt, cold earth, and stagnant water rolling off his woolen coat in dense, suffocating waves that filled my lungs and made my eyes water. He raised his right hand, the one clutching the long, steel archiving needle, and laid it flat against the wooden surface of the table with a dull, heavy thud. Directly beneath his palm, the stacks of catalogued index cards, case files, and handwritten reports began to change. The black ink printed on the paper did not smudge or blur as if wiped away. Instead, the individual letters shifted, rearranged themselves, and reformed into a completely new set of words under the pressure of his touch, writing out an ongoing inventory of my own panic in real time with terrifying precision. Matthew, heart rate elevated, cataloging failure, preparing for disposal, case pending. Think about how much confidence we place in our written records, believing that ink on paper is a permanent, objective record of the truth that protects us from ambiguity and chaos. We write the reports, we stamp the dates, and we trust that language is an unshakable anchor in a world that often feels disordered. We believe that text belongs to the author, the clerk, the institution that files it away. Then an anonymous entity presses his hand against your papers and starts rewriting your own history while you watch, line by line, and you realize your life is just another file waiting to be edited out of existence by someone else's hand. I gripped the edges of the heavy oak table with both hands, my knuckles turning white as I tried to push myself backward, but my legs remained utterly unresponsive beneath the chair, frozen in place by an invisible, crushing force. The cassette player on the corner of the desk continued to run its motor, its magnetic ribbon now spilling entirely out of the plastic housing in a tangled, brown nest over the edge of the wood, trailing down toward the floor. Without any mechanical power feeding it through the capstan, the loose ribbon began to vibrate on its own, producing a low, rhythmic scratching sound against the desk surface that matched the steady, frantic pulse of my own racing blood. The acoustic environment inside the vault narrowed entirely to that dry, rhythmic friction, accompanied by the faint, electrical humming and buzzing of the dying desk lamp overhead, which threatened to plunge the room back into absolute blackness at any moment. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if the words on your desk started rewriting themselves into your own obituary while a faceless man stood inches away? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. As the faceless figure raised the steel needle higher, preparing to bring it down toward my chest with calculated, deliberate slowness, the entire stone wall behind filing cabinet number 7 began to groan and fracture from the inside out. A deep, structural groan echoed through the subterranean stone vault as long, jagged cracks split the ancient limestone blocks behind filing cabinet number 7 with the sound of snapping bone. Fine gray dust and pulverized mortar rained down from the vaulted ceiling in a steady, suffocating cascade, coating the floor, my shoulders, and the scattered papers on the desk in a dry, choking powder that tasted like copper and old earth. I coughed violently, my chest heaving against the dust, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the worsening mechanical screech of masonry tearing apart under immense pressure. Have you ever experienced that primal, bone-deep terror when the foundation of the building you are trapped inside decides to betray you, breaking apart as if the earth itself is rejecting your presence? People always talk about architecture as a permanent sanctuary, thick stone walls, reinforced basements, and heavy foundations built to last for generations against any external threat. They imagine that a concrete and stone archive is a bunker that can withstand anything the world throws at it, keeping the chaos of the outside world safely locked away. They do not know the helpless horror of watching solid masonry split open from within, revealing absolute blackness behind the stone instead of dirt, pipes, or electrical wiring. They do not know what it feels like when the walls of your workplace turn into a living threshold for things that were never meant to see the light of a cellar, turning your sanctuary into a tomb. The faceless man paused, his raised hand halting in mid-air as the fracture lines across the limestone wall widened into gaping fissures that pulsed with a faint, sickly gray light from deep within the void. From deep inside the newly opened cavities of the wall, a low, collective murmur began to rise, not the voice of a single person, but a chaotic chorus of dozens of overlapping whispers speaking in different tones, languages, ages, and registers. They weren't screaming in agony. They were calmly, methodically reciting names, dates, and catalog numbers from cases that had never been officially opened by any police precinct. Case 12, unrecorded female, winter 1968, found in the river Reeds. Case 29, missing male, summer 1971, identity never recovered. Case 42, the face that was never found, file incomplete. The acoustic environment filled completely with that buzzing, multi-layered wall of voices, echoing off the damp stone and turning the archive into a whispering gallery of the unburied dead. Think about how comfortable we grow behind our administrative titles, believing that our job descriptions protect us from the grim histories we manage day in and day out. We file the papers, we check the boxes, and we tell ourselves we are merely impartial clerks doing a necessary municipal service for a city that forgets too easily. We believe that professional detachment and bureaucratic routines are an impenetrable shield against the human cost of the cases we handle. Then the walls of the archive begin to speak the names of every forgotten soul you failed to rescue from the dark, and you realize you're not an employee doing a job, you are the final piece of evidence they collected to complete their archive. I tried to push my chair back once more, my heels scraping violently against the stone floor in a frantic bid for escape, but the floorboards beneath the desk had begun to warp and tilt downward toward the gaping fracture in the wall. The heavy wooden table slid an inch forward, pulled by an unseen gravity that drew every object on its surface, the loose cassette ribbon, the broken red wax seals, the heavy rusting hunting knife, slowly across the wood toward the widening crevice in the masonry. The faceless man did not chase me or rush my movements. He simply stood at the edge of the tilted table, his blank head tilted slightly to the side as if listening intently to the chorus of voices pouring out from the broken stone, waiting for the precise moment the room finished folding in on itself. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep gripping a desk if the wall behind you opened up to reveal an audience of every unsolved murder in the city's history calling out your name? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. As the tilting table drifted another 2 inches toward the fracture, the flickering desk lamp finally blew out with a sharp, blinding electrical pop, plunging the center of the subterranean vault into total, suffocating darkness. Total darkness crashed over the archive like a physical weight, instantly extinguishing the yellow pool of light and leaving only the faint, sickly phosphorescent glow emanating from the jagged, bleeding cracks in the stone wall. The air grew instantly colder, the temperature plunging so fast that my breath turned into thick, white plumes of condensation in the absolute blackness, swirling around my face like smoke. Every reference point I had relied on, the edges of the desk, the position of the chair, the distance to the door, vanished entirely, swallowed by an inky void that felt heavy, dense, and suffocating. Have you ever experienced that utter, disorienting panic when sight is completely stolen from you in an enclosed space, leaving your body entirely at the mercy of sound, touch, and terror? People always talk about darkness as a simple absence of light, a passive, empty condition that you can eventually adapt to once your eyes adjust to the shadows. They imagine that shadows are harmless hiding places where nothing can reach you unless you step into its path. They do not know the suffocating claustrophobia of a subterranean vault where the dark feels alive, dense, and hostile, pressing against your skin like a wet blanket soaked in river water. They do not know what it feels like when you can no longer see the walls, the table, or the entity standing across from you, yet you can feel their freezing breath moving closer through the air, tracking your heartbeat in the dark. I sat frozen in the pitch black, my hands pressed flat against the warped surface of the wooden table, listening intently to the microscopic acoustic changes in the room. The multi-layered whispering from the broken stone wall had stopped entirely. In its place came a new, terrifying acoustic detail that made my stomach churn, the soft, wet, dragging sound of something heavy crawling across the loose dust, broken glass, and stone debris on the floor. Scritch, drag, scritch, drag. It was moving in a wide, deliberate circle around my desk, slowly narrowing its path with every rotation, closing the distance between us without a single word, a single breath, or a rushed movement. Think about how deeply we trust our eyes to map our surroundings, believing that as long as we know where the doors, desks, and exits are, we can navigate any emergency that comes our way. We map our rooms in our heads, we memorize our daily paths, and we trust our visual memory to keep us safe in times of crisis. We believe that safety is something you can see coming, something you can spot across a room before it reaches you. Then the lights fail permanently, the room reshapes itself in the dark, and you realize you're trapped in a maze where the walls are moving and the hunter doesn't need light to find your pulse. I lifted my right hand slowly from the wooden table, my fingers trembling violently as I intended to feel along the edge of the drawers where the heavy iron keys to the archive cabinets were kept. My fingertips brushed against something cold, damp, and fibrous. It wasn't the smooth oak of the desk. It wasn't metal or paper. It was the frozen, sodden fabric of the heavy winter coat worn by the faceless man. He was standing right beside my chair, so close that the foul, decaying reek of river mud, stagnant water, and rotting earth filled my lungs entirely, making my vision swim with sudden, violent dizziness. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay still if you reached out in the dark and accidentally touched the coat of a dead man standing inches from your face? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. Before I could jerk my hand away in blind panic, a heavy, freezing cold grip closed tightly around my wrist, locking my arm to the wooden table with the absolute, unyielding strength of an industrial vice. The freezing grip around my wrist tightened with a sudden, crushing pressure that instantly paralyzed the radial nerve in my forearm, sending white-hot spikes of pain shooting straight up to my shoulder. It wasn't the grip of a living man of flesh and bone. It felt like an iron shackle forged at the bottom of a frozen river, bearing the dead, immovable weight of an anchor that had rested in silt and black mud for 7 decades. I tried to scream, but the air in my lungs turned instantly to dry ice, choking off my voice before it could clear my teeth. Have you ever experienced that complete, body-shattering realization that you are no longer dealing with a physical adversary, but with a gravitational force that has pulled you past the threshold of the living world? People always talk about physical confrontation in terms of leverage, muscle memory, and the instinct to fight back against an attacker. They imagine that strength, adrenaline, and a desperate burst of energy can break any hold if you just push hard enough against your bonds. They do not know the soul-crushing despair of a grip that defies anatomy, where every bone in your wrist feels like it is about to snap like brittle dry twigs under the pressure of an invisible vice. They do not know what it feels like when your entire physical body is rendered utterly helpless, turned into a mere object to be pulled across a table by a hand that has no pulse. Dragged by an irresistible, mechanical force, my entire upper body lurched forward across the warped wooden surface of the desk. The scattered papers, the broken red wax seals, and the tangled brown ribbon of the cassette tape slid away from beneath my elbows, crashing down into the unseen abyss below with a flurry of faint, dry rustles. My face came within inches of the jagged, phosphorescent fracture in the stone wall, where the sickly gray light pulsed like a dying heartbeat. And from deep within that widening chasm, the sound of rushing water began to swell. It wasn't the clean, refreshing sound of a running stream or rainfall. It was a heavy, sluggish, subterranean tide, the unmistakable sound of Black River water sloshing against old brick foundations, carrying with it the wet, rotten weight of decayed leaves, rusted iron, and things that had been buried in the mud long before the archive was ever built. Think about how foolishly we build our cities and our institutions over old, forgotten graves, believing that a few feet of concrete and thick limestone foundations are enough to bury the past forever. We pave over the wetlands, we seal the cellars, and we write municipal zoning laws that pretend the earth underneath us has no memory of what it swallowed. We believe that civilization is a permanent roof over our heads, keeping the deep mud and the drowned things safely locked in the dark. Then a wall cracks open in a basement archive, and you realize the city was built on a swamp, and the swamp has finally come up to collect its overdue files. The freezing water poured through the jagged fissures in the stone wall in a sudden, violent surge, splashing icy spray across my face and soaking the knees of my wool trousers as it pooled rapidly on the uneven floorboards. The faceless man did not move an inch from my side. With his left hand still locking my wrist to the warped desk, he reached down into the rising water with his free hand, retrieving the long, steel archiving needle that had fallen from the table during the chaos. The pale, smooth skin of his faceless head turned slowly toward me, tracking my terror despite having no eyes to see with, as he raised the sharp steel point toward my chest with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The acoustic environment inside the vault was now entirely consumed by the roar of the subterranean tide, drowning out my ragged breathing, the buzzing of the dead lamps, and the echoes of the distant city above. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if the floor beneath your boots turned into a rising river of black mud and cold water while a faceless man raised a steel needle to your heart? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. As the cold water rose to my ankles and the steel tip pressed against the fabric of my shirt, the final red wax seal on the corner of the desk snapped entirely in half, and the room dissolved completely into the dark, rushing tide. The cold water rose past my ankles with terrifying speed, surging across the warped floorboards in a thick, churning tide of black mud and floating paper scraps. Every single catalog card, unverified report, and handwritten index entry I had spent the night sorting was swept up into the swirling vortex, transformed in an instant into a blizzard of sodden white debris spinning blindly across the surface of the subterranean flood. My right wrist remained pinned to the oak table by that iron-cold, inescapable grip, my body suspended at an agonizing angle over the widening fracture in the limestone wall. Have you ever experienced that complete, surreal dissociation when the physical reality you trust entirely is instantly swallowed by an element that has no business being inside a locked stone cellar? People always talk about water as a life-giving force, something clean and refreshing that fills rivers, oceans, and reservoirs under the open sky. They imagine that drowning is something that happens out in the open water, far from shore, under bright sunlight or stormy waves. They do not know the suffocating horror of a basement flood where the water is thick, ancient, and foul, smelling of centuries of buried sediment and dead things that never reached the surface. They do not know what it feels like when a room you know down to the last brick transforms into an underground river before your eyes, trapping you in a tomb of your own filing routine. The faceless man stood waist-deep in the rising black tide, his mud-caked winter coat billowing softly beneath the surface like heavy aquatic weeds. He didn't pull me down all at once. Instead, with a calculated, mechanical patience, he eased my grip off the edge of the desk, sliding my body inch by inch toward the ragged, glowing fissure in the masonry. Through that gaping tear in the wall, I could see no conventional room, no hallway, and no exit. Beyond the stone lay an endless, subterranean cavern stretching out into the dark, a vast, flooded warehouse of infinite rows of rusted iron shelving units submerged under black water, where thousands of unidentified boxes floated silently in the gloom, illuminated only by the faint, pulsing phosphorescence of rotting records. Think about how stubbornly we cling to the illusion that our work leaves a lasting mark, believing that sorting papers, writing names, and organizing files creates an orderly record that outlives us. We spend our lives filing documents, cross-referencing numbers, and telling ourselves we are preserving history against the erosion of time. We believe that our clerical labor matters in the grand scheme of things. Then the archive floods with the forgotten silt of the city's past, and you realize you aren't preserving history at all, you are just organizing the lost items for the people who live in the dark. The cold water rose to my chest now, stealing the warmth from my skin and turning my muscles numb and unresponsive as the current pulled my legs out from beneath the desk entirely. The long steel archiving needle still gleamed in the faceless man's hand, catching the sickly gray light spilling from the cavern wall. He brought the point down slowly, stopping just a fraction of an inch above my breastbone, pressing against the cloth of my shirt with the weight of a final, unalterable stamp. The deafening roar of the subterranean tide filled my ears, washing away the last remaining sounds of the world above. No distant traffic, no ceiling fan, no ticking clocks. Just the steady, rhythmic dripping of water echoing across an infinite, flooded vault. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep writing if you knew every word you set down was just another label for the deep water? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. As the faceless man drove the steel needle home and the black water closed completely over my head, the final entry in the logbook was sealed, and the archive fell into an eternal, undisturbed silence. The sudden, violent rush of Black River water vanished in a single, tearing heartbeat, replaced not by the silence of death, but by the dry, irritating scrape of a vintage ceiling fan rotating in slow, agonizing circles overhead. I gasped aloud, my chest heaving as I sat bolt upright in the wooden chair, my lungs suddenly burning with the sharp, chemical tang of treated paper, cold pipe tobacco, and aging printing ink. My fingers clawed frantically at the wooden surface of the desk, searching for the cold, crushing grip of the faceless man, but found only smooth oak, slightly tacky with the residue of spilled coffee. Have you ever experienced that staggering, disorienting vertigo when you snap out of a waking nightmare and realize you are right back where you started, as if the entire horror never happened? People always talk about nightmares as mental illusions that vanish the moment you open your eyes in a safe, lit room. They imagine that fear is neatly contained within the boundaries of a dream, leaving no physical trace behind once consciousness returns. They do not know the lingering, skin-crawling terror of waking up to find that while the monster is gone, the environment around you has subtly, fundamentally changed. They do not know what it feels like when you look down at your hands and realize your skin is still freezing cold, your clothes are still damp with Phantom River mud, and the desk in front of you has shifted an inch to the left. I forced my trembling eyes open, blinking away the heavy haze of exhaustion as the yellow glow of the small desk lamp cut through the shadows of the subterranean vault. The Chicago Police Evidence Archive was quiet. Dead quiet. No water pooled around my boots. No jagged cracks split the limestone walls behind filing cabinet number 7. The iron security doors at the far end of the cellar remained firmly shut, sealed in the mundane, bureaucratic silence of 1981. And yet, right in the absolute center of the oak table, directly in front of me, sat Case 42. The heavy wooden lid was closed tightly, secured once more by an unbroken, pristine red wax seal stamped with the precinct crest. Beside the box, the portable cassette player sat dark and silent, its magnetic ribbon neatly wound inside a fresh, unplayed cassette shell with a completely blank white label. Think about how desperately we rely on the boundaries of reality, believing that waking up from a nightmare means you have escaped its consequences. We wipe the sweat from our foreheads, we take a deep breath, and we tell ourselves it was only our imagination playing tricks on us in the dead of night. We believe that time moves forward in a straight line, leaving our terrifying experiences safely trapped in the past. Then you notice a single detail out of place, a scratch on a wooden table, a damp smell in the air, or a wax seal that has been pressed twice, and you realize you didn't wake up from the nightmare. You woke up inside the next iteration of the file. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I stared down at the closed wooden box, my hands hovering inches above the brittle red wax. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to pack up my lamp, walk away from the table, and leave the archive forever. Instead, my right hand moved forward on its own, my index finger brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the fresh wax seal. As my skin touched the red wax, a faint, metallic scratch echoed softly from the empty corner of the room, the distinct sound of filing cabinet number 7 sliding open an inch in the dark. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would wait before breaking the seal on a box you swore you had already finished? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. I pressed my thumb down hard into the wax, shattering the seal with a sharp, familiar crack, and reached out to lift the heavy wooden lid once more. The heavy wooden lid lifted with the exact same dry, splintering groan as before, releasing another cloud of choking dust that caught the yellow beam of the desk lamp in a familiar, golden dance. I stared down into the interior of the box, expecting to find the rusted hunting knife, the torn winter coat, and the scratched cassette tape. Instead, the box was entirely empty, save for a single, freshly printed sheet of paper resting at the very bottom, and an old, heavy-nibbed fountain pen filled with dark, wet ink that glistened under the light. Have you ever experienced that profound, soul-weary realization that you are trapped in an infinite loop of your own labor, where every ending is just another beginning written in someone else's handwriting? People always talk about life as a journey with a definitive destination, a story with a final chapter where all the loose threads are tied together and the mystery is resolved. They imagine that hard work, perseverance, and endurance will eventually lead you out of the dark and back into the light of day. They do not know the dizzying horror of an endless archive where the work is never finished, the files never close, and every door you open only leads deeper into the system. They do not know what it feels like when you realize you aren't an employee examining history, but a permanent fixture of the inventory, bound to the desk until the paper runs out. I leaned forward, my breath hitching in my throat as I read the single line of text typed neatly across the center of the blank sheet of paper inside the box. Asterisk, Case 43, Matthew Walid. Status, pending final classification. Asterisk. Before my brain could process the letters, the fountain pen beside the paper began to tilt on its own, rising an inch off the wood as if lifted by an invisible hand. It hovered in the air for a fraction of a second, the dark wet nib dripping a single, perfect drop of ink onto the corner of the page, before turning its point directly toward me. The acoustic environment around the desk shifted once more, stripping away the hum of the ceiling fan and replacing it with the sound of dozens of heavy steel file drawers opening simultaneously across the entire subterranean vault, echoing through the dark in a deafening, metallic chorus. Think about how stubbornly we believe we are the authors of our own lives, writing our own stories, making our own choices, and deciding how our chapters unfold. We hold the pen, we set the terms, and we trust that our names belong exclusively to us. We believe we have dominion over the narrative we create. Then an unseen hand hands you the pen for a file bearing your own name, and you realize you were never writing the history, you were just waiting for your turn to be signed away. The floating fountain pen drifted slowly closer across the edge of the oak table, stopping right above my right hand, which still rested flat against the wood. Without my consent, without any signal from my own nervous system, my fingers uncurled, turned palm upward, and opened beneath the nib. The dark, wet metal pressed gently against the center of my palm, cool and heavy like a drop of river water, tracing the lines of my skin with deliberate, agonizing precision. The whispers from the dark corners of the archive began to rise again, not chaotic this time, but unified, rhythmic, and calm, reciting the final lines of an inventory that had been waiting for me since 1981. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would hold a pen if you knew what name it was about to write at the bottom of the page? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. As the pen pressed deep into my skin and began to write my final signature across the dark, the desk lamp blew out for the last time, and the archive closed its doors forever. The darkness that followed the final blowout of the desk lamp was not the ordinary, breathable dark of a basement room with the power cut. It was a physical, heavy medium, a suffocating suspension of absolute nothingness that coated my skin like wet soot and filled my mouth with the dry, metallic taste of iron filings and old ink. My hand remained outstretched, palm upward against the cold oak of the table, yet the wood beneath my fingertips had vanished. There was no desk. There was no chair. There was no stone floor beneath my boots. Have you ever experienced that dizzying, vertigo-inducing sensation of falling through an infinite vertical drop while your mind stubbornly insists you are still sitting completely still? People always talk about the transition between life and the unknown as a sudden flash or a quiet closing of doors. They imagine that when an archive closes, you simply stop existing within its walls, vanishing cleanly from the registry like a cancelled subscription. They do not know the agonizing stretch of the intermediate space, that endless corridor of transitional static where you are neither fully in the room nor completely dissolved into the floor. They do not know what it feels like when your own skeleton becomes transparent, and your thoughts begin to fray at the edges like ancient, water-damaged parchment fluttering in a draft. Out of the surrounding void, a faint, rhythmic sound began to materialize. It wasn't the roar of the subterranean river, nor was it the multi-layered chorus of the unburied dead. It was the steady, mechanical clicking of thousands of typewriter keys striking paper simultaneously, echoing through an impossible space that stretched out in every direction as far as the imagination could reach. Clack clack clack, ding. Slowly, a dim, sickly gray light, the same phosphorescent glow that had bled from the fractured limestone wall, began to seep upward from beneath my feet. When I looked down, I realized I wasn't standing on stone or mud. My boots were resting on an infinite, seamless floor composed entirely of dense, tightly packed layers of paper index cards, stretching out into a horizon of endless filing shelves that towered upward into a ceiling of absolute blackness. Think about how obsessively we try to leave a paper trail behind us, believing that as long as our names are printed on forms, registered in ledgers, or stamped by an institution, we possess an undeniable permanence in the world. We fill out the documents, we pay the fees, and we trust that bureaucracy is an eternal monument to our existence. We believe that ink on paper is a shield against oblivion. Then you find yourself walking across an endless plain made entirely of other people's forgotten paperwork, and you realize that every file is just another tombstone waiting for a new name to be stamped across its face. A figure stepped out from behind an iron shelving unit 10 paces ahead, tall, gaunt, and wrapped in the familiar, mud-caked folds of a heavy winter coat. He did not walk, he simply glided across the sea of index cards without making a single sound, the long steel archiving needle held casually in his right hand like a pen. He stopped just out of arm's reach, turning his smooth, featureless face toward me as the rhythmic typewriters clicked away in the background. With his free hand, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick, heavy ledger bound in cracked black leather, a volume that seemed to radiate an intense, freezing cold that frosted the air between us. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would remain yours if you opened a ledger and found every single day of your life already typed out in past tense? We are all just temporary catalogers sorting through other people's ruins. The faceless man opened the black leather ledger to the very last page, held out the heavy-nibbed fountain pen toward my floating hand, and waited for the ink to dry.